All right, folks, thanks you so much for attending. It's great to be here at BSidesDayton. This is my fourth BSides Ohio host city conference. There's only one other person that's done that, Jared Brennan, so I'm happy to be the second. My talk today is called Lend Me Your IRs, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt Scheurer. As of right now, at least, I'm still active on Twitter at C3RKAH. Feel free to follow me out there if you would. Also, if you want a copy of the slide deck, this presentation, the slides are available. If you go to slides.dfirmat.com, that will take you to my GitHub repository. You can go into the BSidesDayton folder and grab that. So with that, let's go ahead and kick it off. So what I do is I work for a big, well-known organization. I'm an assistant vice president of computer security and incident response. However, I have a lot of years of hands-on technical experience doing digital forensics and incident response. I'm also a podcast host for Threat Reel. Haven't cranked out a new episode in ages. Hopefully I get that spun back up here before too long. I do volunteer work. I'm an official Hacking is Not a Crime advocate. You can check them out on the web at hackingisnotacrime.org. I'm also a WAMSA technical mentor. That's the Women's Security Alliance. And always looking for mentors and mentees. Great program. Please get involved. It's wamsa.org for their website. Quick disclaimer is that yes, I do have a day job. However, the opinions expressed are based solely on my own independent security research, do not express or reflect the views or opinions of my employer. My objectives today are to show demo reenactments of real attacks, how these real-world attacks worked, how and why they defeated security solutions, and then show incident responses to those attacks. And then along the way, I'm going to demo investigation tools and techniques, and then discuss lessons learned and key takeaways. Just to make sure we're all starting on the same page, some acronyms that you might hear bantered about are IOC or IOC, which is an indicator of compromise, IR, which would be incident response, not infrared in this case, DFIR, which will be digital forensics and incident response. So, other disclaimers is that the demos are based on 100% true stories. These demos dutifully recreate actual attacks. However, some details were altered. Investigation demos in this talk are sped up considerably in the interest of allotted time. And you're going to see me demo stuff on a live laptop. Don't do that. Use an actual dedicated sandbox for that purpose, the one that's properly isolated. So this talk, unlike a lot of talks, I still sometimes do live demos. And I do these because I'm either bold, fearless, or crazy. Please pick two, so I'm not just crazy. All right, let's go ahead and get going here. The first scenario I've got, I call it the mystery attachment. And to preface this, there was a news headline from August in 2018 called Mouse Spam Campaign Targets Banks Using Microsoft Publisher. Mouse spam campaigns are nothing new. They've been around forever. Targeting banks is nothing new. That's been happening since there's been banks. Using Microsoft Publisher to deliver that payload is kind of interesting because you expect to see that in maybe Word documents, certainly Excel, spreadsheets, and those kinds of macros. You might even expect to see payloaded PDF documents, that sort of thing. Microsoft Publisher is the delivery mechanism, highly unusual. So that's why this thing essentially got published in the news, and there is a link in the slide deck to TrustWave, who were the first people to break this story. It later got picked up by numerous news outlets, and so we'll talk about that here in a minute. So just to preface what was happening, I'm sitting at my desk, dutifully working on who knows how many things, multitasking as usual, and all of a sudden I have a frantic visitor come running up to my desk. So I'm not going to identify this person, but I eventually end up working for them, and I eventually end up leaving that place because of them. But neither here nor there. Before those times, come up, Matt, help! One of our VIPs with access to lots of very sensitive information just got hit in that recent mouse spam campaign targeting banks. It matches all the IOCs from reports of that new flawed Amy rat, which is part of the Occurs botnet. The recipient attempted to open the MS Publisher attachment on their smartphone. I need you to drop whatever you're doing and investigate this. We'll get you the attachment as soon as possible. Now, when they first came up, it's like, oh, it's another request. Yeah, sure, I'll get to it soon. But the more they stood there and kept talking to me, they were so amped up. And because of who it was and the level of information this person had access to, it was concerning. And so I'm not the best mobile forensics guy in the world. Probably, I don't even claim that. But there's really nobody else where I'm working that's really capable of it, so sure, I'll take a crack at it. I'm probably our best option. But yeah, I just the more they stood there and talked, their anxiousness, they got me worked up. And so that's kind of where my mind was at. So once they got me the attachment, that's all I saw. I had this tunnel vision, and we're going to talk about that. So the investigation, so I'm going to open this up in a pretend sandbox. Again, you should use a real one, and I'm going to talk through the detonation research attempts and failure to understand anything about the malicious file. I'm going to do a quick strings demo, and then I'm going to hash the file, show you what it looked like when I was doing research, and then finally we're going to look at some EXIF data, really while I was pondering my next steps. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take a look at this file. Oops, I don't need that anymore. This particular file is going to open up in, it's going to open up in LibreOffice Draw because I don't actually have Publisher on here. Now what's interesting is I did have a commercial sandbox solution available to me, and that actually did have Microsoft Publisher that I was able to look at this. So let me blow this up a little bit just to make it a little bit more readable here. If I can zoom in a bit, that's a little bit too much. I couldn't really get the macro prompt to trigger, but basically the document was something like this. Might be a little bit of an eye chart. I couldn't get the zoom quite right here, but basically something along the lines of macros must be enabled to view the contents of this document. To display the contents, click the Enable Content button. And what was really interesting is I'm not a guru on Publisher. I know next to nothing about it other than I'd heard of it. So no matter what I did, I could not get these macro prompts to trigger. The automated sandbox detonation came back, gave it a clean bill of health, nothing to see here. I also looked at this thing in other antivirus engines and so forth, and I'll talk about that. Nothing really picked us up as bad, but that was sort of concerning because I'm thinking, could this be customized malware? Could they really be targeting us if, those are the kind of thoughts going to my head. So having looked at the file, having sort of, failed to do that, one thing I like to do is, sort of run things through strings just to see what's happening in a file. So if I run strings, one thing I like to do with strings is essentially pipe this out to less because then I can basically arrow through it. Line at a time. Ooh, that didn't work. All right, hold on. I know why. I didn't spell strings all the way. That helps. All right, here we go. So, basically all the stuff you would expect to see in a Microsoft Publisher file. I basically looked through this file, looked at all the lines, didn't really find anything interesting. Sometimes you find some interesting artifacts. Sometimes you find things that are maybe intended to be comments, but they're actually there. So strings, what it does is it takes a file, finds the human readable text, and spits it out. If you pipe it out to something like more or less, it gives you a little more control over how much output you're looking at any one given time. So I didn't really find anything particularly interesting in that. So then I decided I'm going to go ahead and hash the file and do some searching on it. And there's a couple things you can do to run hashes, usually for purposes of identification. You wouldn't want to depend on it for other things, but if you're looking at something that might be malicious, MD5 sums typically will give you the MD5 hash value of the file. That's that unique cryptographic hash that's something you can look for in security tools. If you're really concerned about it, you can do something like SHA-256 sum and get the SHA-256 value. I think the most important thing with this is sort of know what's in your environment and know what your security tools support and what the best options are, and really just kind of hone in on that, use that in as much as you can. So I had the hash values. So what can you do with that? Well, you can search online for it. And so one thing I did, and I know it's not really going to be real legible, but you can see the search value in the address has that hash value. And here's what I talked about where there were no matches found on VirusTotal. All kinds of things get submitted to VirusTotal all the time. It can be really useful in identifying things, whether they're potentially malicious or even just to get a history of this was a legitimate file, and you can determine, based on previous results and sometimes community comments and that sort of thing, what's there. So nothing there. Jotty Malware Scan's kind of like an alternative service. They have many of the same engines, but there's a little bit, there's a little bit of overlap, but it's another engine you can look at things. When I ran the search on the hash value there, again, you can see hash not found. And so hybrid analysis is another engine you can use to do like an online sandboxed analysis of files, and it'll do that, sort of dynamic analysis, running like Windows samples in a Windows VM and spitting out the output of what it determines on that. And again, a lot of stuff gets submitted there, but once again, no results. And I believe last I knew they were using the Falcon engine to do their analysis. So going through all of those things, and I'm getting nowhere, and that's where it made me think, like maybe this is, again, a customized sample. Maybe we're targeted. Maybe we're getting hit with something custom. That's a little more dangerous because now it's not just somebody spraying and praying a wide net on malware, potentially. They have really dialed in on us, and they're really genuinely going after us. And just for laughs, I did try searching hash values on Google. Came back with absolutely nothing. So unfortunately, that didn't really turn out to be beneficial as I'd hoped. And so, really at that point, I had also, I'm not going to demo it, but I also spent a lot of time researching Flawed Amy, reading about it. I spent a lot of time reading Nakur's botnet. I spent a lot of time trying to dig into Publisher. And what was crazy is, no matter what I did, I just couldn't quite figure it out. And so now my mind shifts to how do I address this? We have an executive assistant to the CEO has tried to open this on their Apple smartphone. Well, chances that could actually infect it are probably pretty low, but that's not a risk tolerance I'm comfortable with. So what do I do about that? Well, I don't know. Maybe we could do a security wipe on the device, hand it back to them. Might be enough. I'm still not comfortable with that thought at risk. I looked, the user was not due for a device refresh yet, but they were less than 6 months out. So maybe we just confiscate the device, power it, put it in airplane mode, power it off, and throw it in the forensics lab drawer in case we ever need to look at it again, just give them a new device. But as I'm thinking these things, I thought, well, this is the dumbest thing ever, but I didn't look at the EXIF data. I just kind of didn't think to do that. And EXIF is not perfect because all EXIF data could be spoofed. So it could be a red herring, but I went ahead to do that anyway. And so in Linux, you got the Perl EXIF tool, which will help you look at samples. And so running this through and just kind of looking at the top parts of this, it kind of matched up with what you would expect. These like FPX things down here and image /vnd.fpx for the MIME type. These things actually match Microsoft Publisher. So this appears to genuinely be created in Microsoft Publisher. Everything matched up. When I get down to the author, it didn't exactly say test phish, but I'll talk about what it did say. It actually had the name of our test phishing vendor. After all the hours of research and all the scrambling and pondering and analysis and research and looking for things, It looks like it came from our test phishing vendor, and I realized I just squandered all these hours of time because I got dialed in on this attachment. What I forgot to do was follow my own advice and look at the message headers. So I decided to look at the message headers because, again, EXIF data could be spoofed, and I determined, based on the message headers, that yes, it really did come from our test phishing vendor. Of course, I read the headers as, yes, Matt, this really is your test phishing vendor's IP address, you dolt. So it's okay if you want to laugh at my pain on that. It was a painful lesson learned, to be sure. What went wrong is I got caught up in the moment by subconsciously letting somebody else influence my investigation. Their anxiety and bad assumptions totally wore off on me. And one should always start with the message headers when investigating phishing emails and contents. The one time I abandoned my own standards, I got hyper-focused on the bad attachment first because I let that outside person influence my investigation. So in this case, there really was no technical remediation. It was really just painful lessons learned that I should stick with my standard investigative processes and procedures because if I did that by starting with the message headers first, I could have closed this thing out in minutes instead of hours. So because of that, there were no further technical actions required. Scenario 2 is something I call security scanner evasion. In this case, the preface is identical phishing emails started hitting inboxes. We were getting wide-scale reports of phishing, and they were just pouring in. We were getting flooded with them. The phishing page link no longer appeared to be working in our security scanner tools. So had to ask the question, was the malicious site already down? Was it already taken offline? Well, we got to investigate that to figure that out, because at first glance, it looks like it's down. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the email message source code. We're going to note any hyperlinks that we find in there, and then we're going to check the landing page with the security scanner, and I'm just going to, again, sort of pretend demo that here. And then we're going to look at the landing page source code, and then we're going to open up the phishing page in, again, our pretend sandbox. So let's go ahead and take a look at the message source first. Yeah, let me make this bigger here. All right, so I realize not all of this is going to be readable, but in my case here, we have the email from evil.scammer@promisewearelegit.com to phishing target, which is unwitting.victim@randomtarget.org. And the subject is, this link is totally safe. Why wouldn't you trust it? And our demo email here is, hello, phishing target. We have a really important message for you. To retrieve your message, click here. Real subtle. And then it says, regards, spoof sender. So let's go ahead and take a look at the source code. I'm in Thunderbird, but you can do this with pretty much most any mail client. So let me go ahead and make this a little bit bigger here. So I've got a bunch of message headers. If I search for HTTP in here, I should find HTTP or HTTPF references, and so here we have our hyperlink. Now, you can mouse over on emails, and you can also right-click and copy. I tend to like to mouse over. There was a historic issue with some email clients where on hover or on mouse over would execute JavaScript and could actually do malicious things. That's been fixed most of the places I've looked at, but still, just knowing that history in the back of my head, I still tend to prefer to personally go to the source code and grab that. And so, again, in our pretend sandbox, let's actually see what happens. And again, this is actually my pretend security scanner tool. So this is what my security scanner tool sees, which is a 404 page. Again, this thing looks like it's taken offline. If this page is truly offline, I've got nothing to worry about unless it gets weaponized later or something like that. But usually once something's found and remediated, threat actors tend to move around. They tend to not hit that same place. I'm not saying they won't, but the likelihood goes down a little bit. But if I stopped right here, I'm just going to sort of realize that maybe I cut this investigation a little short. So let's go ahead and actually look at the source code here. We're going to talk about a couple things as I do this. Let me quit out of here and clear this. And so to look at the source code, I've got a couple different options. I can use wget and essentially put in the web address, and it's going to pull down a copy of that for me so I can look at the source code sort of offline. I could also use curl. You can use curl for a lot of things, but I'll go ahead and put in the site here, and you can output curl to a file, and we'll just call it unknown.html. And so when I clear this, let's look at HTML files that we pulled down. What is interesting though, because I'm doing a demo on my local system, is when wget pulls down that file, it actually has the original date. Normally that's what you would get. Since I use curl on a local endpoint, it's pulling down the local date and time. So that's kind of an artifact of me doing a localized demo, but what you notice is the byte size is exactly the same. And so really the question is, are these files, in fact, forensically the same? Let's take a look at that. Oops. Helps if I put in sum. So I'm just doing a SHA-256 sum, the HTML files, and notice that the SHA-256 values, the hash, is identical for both. So it doesn't matter which method I use to obtain this file. They're both forensically sound. So the point is, use whatever tools you have available already, particularly in some environments if it's not a good idea to just install tools and utilities that may not already be there. So it doesn't matter which one of these we look at. I'll take a look at the index file here just so we can see the source code. And I will make this bigger so it's easier to read. Let me maximize the window here as well. So we've got some interesting stuff here. Certainly not a 404 page, but well, I'll explain what this does actually. So we can tell based on the top this is JavaScript. And what we see here are some if navigator.userAgent index of, and you see Chrome here. Here you see Edge. Here you see Firefox, old school Internet Explorer. Down here, Opera, Safari. So these are very common web browsers. What it's doing is it's taking a look to see if it's a real web browser that's hitting the page based on the user agent string. If it doesn't match the user agent strings, it's replacing that with an alternate location, this login.html file that's buried a couple, elsewhere within the directory structure. And then when it gets to the bottom, if it didn't match any of those, in other words, if it's not a real web browser, it's actually what's directing to this 404 page. So that gets very interesting because our security scanner tool isn't an actual web browser. So it's actually giving me a screen scrape that shows this 404 page. But if I actually look at it in the sandbox itself using a real native browser, what I get here is actually a malicious Microsoft 365 login credential harvesting page. So it's a pretty clever ruse. And I think that's really what I found interesting here, because I could identify that the threat actors took some steps to check, make sure it's a real web browser hitting. If not, go ahead and hide the fact that it's not a real web browser by giving them a 404 page, make them think the page is down. It becomes harder to detect, harder to analyze. When you actually see it in the real world, the result is the browser user agent string redirection will send real browsers to the real credential harvesting page. And I got lucky here because the threat actors had actually used JavaScript, which is a client-side language. If it was a server-side language, and I list several examples here, but if it was any server-side language, I'm not going to be able to see the code. I would be able to tell that the redirect happened, particularly if I'm doing like a packet capture or something along those lines, but I may not understand why the redirection happened. In this case, I got lucky, and if the threat actors used server-side language, would not have been able to see the code and understand why the redirect is working, because there's a whole lot of ways you can redirect web traffic. And so this is also kind of dangerous to think about, because if you have a vulnerable web browser, let's just arbitrarily pick Firefox as an example. If I have a drive-by download kit that will exploit a known vulnerability for Firefox, I could check the traffic coming in. If it's Firefox, round robin, execute my payload, and then send them to whatever page I want. And while all other browsers will just send the traffic to the proper website. Again, makes it harder to catch, harder to detect. And the other thing is, you can get very granular with that. With user agent string, you could detect specific versions. So if Firefox puts out a patch that fixes that original vulnerability, I could check for vulnerable versions and send just the vulnerable versions to my payload, while as a threat actor, and then basically have everything else go to whatever it should. So those, again, make it very hard to detect, because if you're not looking at it with the right version of the user agent string and they're using server-side languages for that, it's going to be really tough to catch that. So in this case, the remediation is we determined the actual phishing landing page, and we blocked it through web content filtering. Then we worked with our secure email gateway vendor to block the active phishing campaign. My third scenario, I called the rabbit hole. And with this, I received a request from a user to investigate an email message they received to determine if it was legitimate or not. So the email appeared fishy at first glance, but I had to ask the question, is it just suspicious or is it malicious? And for those who have seen me talk for years, that's the name of a talk I gave a long time ago at a lot of different places. So the investigation was, I could tell from the message headers that the source IP address was a mismatch from the sender's domain. We're going to take a look at this, but the message source code was particularly interesting because the link text didn't match the actual hyperlink. And we'll look at that here in just a moment. The malicious threat actor's objective appeared to be a credential harvesting site for the purposes of account takeover. So let's go ahead and take a look at this message and see what we have here. So here's an email sample that comes in here. And we'll make this bigger. And so the from address here, because I know it's going to be impossible to read for much of the room, it's ppsupport@pwned-server.org. Again, not a PayPal domain, right? Could be anything, but if it's not PayPal, and they get real clever because you get all these look-alike domains, puny code domains, a lot of ways you can try to make something that's not the proper website look like it is. And then it's to, again, our phishing target, unwitting.victim@randomtarget.org. And the subject is PayPal bank account change confirmation. If you have a PayPal account and you didn't make any account changes, why are you getting this email? And so it would read something like, Dear PayPal customer, we received a request to update your bank account on file. This process will complete in the next 4 hours. If you did not request these changes to your PayPal account, please log in to reject the pending activity. Now, what that's doing is it's giving the recipient a very small window of time to essentially stop a bank account change. If they have a PayPal account and they didn't make that account change, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, I need to log in right away and reject this change because somebody's messing with my account. And where it gets tricky here is that the actual link text is PayPal's actual login. However, looks can be deceiving, and that's not really where it goes. So let's go ahead and take a look at the message source here. Again, I'll make this bigger so we can kind of find it. And again, use my little find HTTP trick here. And so what's interesting is over here we have that hyperlink that we read in the email message. So there's the link text right there going to PayPal's legit login page, but the actual hyperlink itself is going to some web server in .be domain, which would be Belgium. I'm probably not logging into PayPal in Belgium in most cases, so that right there should be a huge red flag. So we've got this international domain. Again, we've got a not proper domain that was the sender. This thing is just, it's clearly looks like phishing, but let's see if we can understand what's going on, because again, a user reported this activity. So we'll go ahead and let's actually take a look at that page again in our pretend sandbox. And so, whoops, what did I do? All right, so here we have a PayPal login page. And in this case, it looks a lot like the PayPal login page, all the way down to the fave icon and the top of the browser, email or mobile number. The address certainly will probably look weird, but we know this isn't the right PayPal login page, so what's going on here? Let's go ahead and grab the source code and find out. So I'm going to use curl again. I'm going to put in the web address, and I'm going to direct the output. And I'll call it first page.html. Oops. And you could use any text editor you want to look at this stuff, but it's a little easier to demo from just the built-in gedit utility. And so we see something interesting here. For a login page, there is not a lot of code to this. What we see is an HTTP equiv equals refresh. This is a meta tag refresh. The content equals 0 means it waits 0 seconds, so it's instantaneous. There could be like a 5-second delay in there. In this case, it's just firing it straight off. But remember, we started with the .be domain, which was Belgium. We have an interesting second address here. And so this is going to .de, so it's actually going to what appear to be a compromised web server in Germany. And so that's the second page that we have, and it's really directing the output there. So that first phishing link wasn't exactly where this is going. So we looked at that. Let's go ahead and grab the source code for this and see if we can understand what's going on here. So again, curl, I'm going to paste in the web address that I just got based on that source code that I pulled down. Yeah, I see that. And we'll just call this second page.html. We'll look at the source code for this. And what we have here is not the same kind of meta refresh we had before. We got a little more code. We got like the title of the page. We've got a little bit of a body. What's interesting though is we have an iframe. And in this case, when you look at this, the absolute position, the width and height being 100%, no border. This is what I would call a seamless iframe. So in other words, you are going to this one domain in this page, but this page is actually serving up content from somewhere completely different. And in this case, we've got a .nl domain. So now we've gone from Belgium to Germany to Netherlands. We've got quite the European tour going on here. And so we want to try to understand what's happening. And it's amazing that we've gone through all these hoops of obfuscation. It started the link text not matching. Then it went to a HTTP meta refresh. Now we got an iframe from somewhere else. So let's go ahead and grab that third page source code and see what's going on here. So once again, I'm going to curl and paste in the address. I'm going to output that to third page. Open it up in a text editor. And now we've gone from stuff we could kind of read to pure gobbledygook here. What we can tell at the top is it's JavaScript. We got this statement in here, this document.write unescape. And it's basically got some encoding behind that. And then I see this thing for df, and I've got a got my parentheses and single apostrophe and a whole bunch of gobbledygook after that. I'm going to guess that's a function. Now, I've actually purposely made this more readable, and some of you are probably thinking that's readable. Well, it kind of isn't understandable, but bear in mind, when you look at these things live, you may not have this lovely white spacing. It might just be one solid wall of stuff, and so you really have to look close to pick it apart. Now, in the olden days, we used to have to figure out the unescaped sequence and feed this function back into it to spit the original code, or that code, out. Fortunately, in more modern times, the web browsers themselves give us some pretty cool developer tools that we can look at and leverage to do the heavy lifting for us. And the important thing is that, the important thing to remember is that if it can be viewed on a web page, then it has to be decodable somehow, because if it wasn't decodable, you'd never see it render, and it would be a waste of the fraudster's time because they would be trying to sell something that had zero chance of working. So let's go ahead and go back into our browser and see. We'll go directly to that third page here. And again, we would do this in our sandbox, not a real web browser. But let's go ahead and pull up developer tools. And I'm just going to reload that page real quick. And that's basically going to feed stuff into my developer tools here. Unfortunately, when you look at this stuff, it's generally still going to be very much encoded. We don't get the whole thing. If I expand some of these things out, it's not really giving me the actual code I want to see. Again, it's decodable, so if I click on the ellipses here, actually I'll take it back. I was looking at the decoded version. This is what you normally see, is the exact same as the source code we just looked at in our text editor at first, but then if you scroll down, you'll actually get to the point where it decodes it, and we should actually see the whole thing, not just a part of it. And lo and behold, here we actually start getting to our contents. And remember we talked about that unescaped sequence before. Well, if you look in here, here we actually have the decoded version of that escape sequence, or that unescaped sequence. And so we can actually see that. What's interesting, though, is we get into stuff we can't read. And looking at this, we've got a MIME type kind of declared here. We have an href equals data image, x icon, base 64. That might be that fave icon that we saw when we were looking at the page live. But we have encoded stuff inside of encoded stuff. So that's interesting. We get back into more source code, and now we have something here. We see data image, JPEG of some sort, base 64. Again, more base 64. So we have encoding inside of encoding, which just increases the layer of obfuscation that the threat actors have used here. And so what's kind of nice with the browser developer tools is if I come into the network tab, I can sort of take a look at the image stuff here. Let me go ahead and get that window out. And so here we can see it actually did decode the image for us. And if I'm looking at this in the headers, again, this is that same base 64. And again, I'm thinking this is an image file in all likelihood. What's cool is if I click on the preview tab, I have my PayPal logo here. And if I go back and I look at the live page, well, there it is right there. It actually took care of that decoding for us. But what's interesting is when we go back to the developer tools, if you remember when we were looking at the code, there were two encoded elements. It's decoded the image file, but there was something early on that didn't get decoded for whatever reason. So let me go back to edit HTML, scroll past all the encoded parts of that. And let's see what's going on here. All right, so here, again, I'm guessing it's a fave icon based on the MIME type defined up here and the fact that it's calling it base 64, probably base 64 encoded. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole blob of stuff. And I'm going to open up a new browser tab. I'm just going to paste it all in here. So let me go ahead and save this to my DFIR folder. And I'll just call it unknown.txt. So here we have that whole base64 thing saved out to a file. There's our base64 save file. So let's go ahead and decode this thing. So if I use the base64 command in Linux, do a -I just to ignore any warnings that might stop it from doing what I want, -D to decode it, and we'll do unknown.txt, and let me go ahead and call that one unknown.ico based on the MIME type. And now if I look inside the folder, I should have an unknown.ico file, and you can tell really from the preview, and if I open this up and blow this thing up, zoom in on it here. Let's see, where am I? Here we are. And again, we have what appears to be probably that fave icon, and I know it's going to be near impossible to read, but up in the browser tab, there it is. So that's how we can decode things using the built-in browser developer tools. There's how we can decode things by hand, doing it old school, how we used to have to do it before we had such wonderful tools built into the browsers. So what we found was that we had encoded elements inside of encoded elements. And whether the threat actor was using these encoded elements just to avoid analysis and detection, because a lot of things won't see it if it's encoded, or encrypted files can pass a lot of security tools, or they just wanted to keep everything in one HTML file just for portability purposes. The fact is they had encoded elements inside of encoded elements. And so if you put together all of these layers of obfuscation, they really went out of their way to try and hide what it is they were doing. And then we looked at decoding it using the browser developer tools. We also looked at how to decode that stuff by hand. In this case, the remediation was we determined the final phishing landing page, and we blocked it through our web content filtering. I believe we probably did the intermediaries as well, because they were clearly compromised domains. And so really, this was back in a time when you could use whois engines before they were all privatized because of the privacy laws of the world today. It used to be you could look up whois contacts and report these things to hosting companies. That was still possible back then, so that's what we did. And so the things I've learned since this talk, because this is kind of an older talk, and this is probably my swan song performance of delivering it. Since those times, I've learned how to use something called CyberChef. CyberChef is what they call the Cyber Swiss Army knife. It is a very powerful tool. A lot of the things I showed you, from strings to encoding to decoding to getting EXIF data, all of those things and a ton more you can do using CyberChef for file analysis, and I use it fairly regularly. Very powerful tool, and you don't have to know coding. You can build together very complex, what they call recipes, by stacking functions on top of one another. And this is an open source, free web application. You could use it online, but you could download the code and run it just as in any HTML5 web browser is capable of handling it. And if you want help getting started, if you go to workshops.dfirmat.com, that will take you out to my GitHub repository. It's about a 2-hour workshop. It's a very small file. You download that file, extract out the zip. There's a text file in there. That's the lab guide. It'll literally walk you through every single step to complete all of the exercises. And it's a very small download, some very powerful things. It'll walk you through a lot of encoding, decoding, how to spot steganography, how to convert timestamps, just a ton of useful things. So definitely check it out, absolutely free. Like I said, it'd take you about 2 hours to go through it. And there's also some references to resources we can really level up those cyber chef skills as well beyond what my introductory workshop will give you. So that's really all I have for my talk, but as you see me hanging around at BSidesDayton, and I'll be around for a while, the all conference, after the conference, stop and share your own DFIR stories with me. So friends, Romans, BSidesDayton attendees, lend me your IRs!